So you had these uneducated bards who would travel from place to place and repeat the entirety of Homer's Iliad and Odyssey from memory.
The Iliad and Odyssey combined are roughly 27,000 lines. If people were doing that from memory in ancient times, what did they know about memorization that we've forgotten?
The main responsibility of disciples was to be able to pass on the teachings of their teacher or their particular school. That was often done the same way that psychologists of memory recommend memory today: spaced practice and repetition.
Today, I'm talking to Dr. Craig Keener, a New Testament scholar and author of 40 books, including a 4,600-page commentary on the book of Acts. And today, he breaks down how ancient people trained memory and why modern tools may actually be making us worse at memorizing.
In antiquity, they didn't have collective retrieval system. We call it Google. But back then, they, even to go look things up in a book, you'd have to remember which book. It's tedious unrolling the scroll, and it just was considered better to memorize things. And among Greeks, to show off their education, they would pepper their speeches or other conversation with classical quotations. And like Paul does with scripture, except classical quotations for somebody who's a Bible major, like Paul, would be scripture. We could go with, and today you have a few people who are really, they memorize a phone book just to show off.
Yeah.
But back then, if you really wanted to show off, obviously they didn't have phone books. But Seneca the Elder, he gives an extreme example. Some people have probably heard of Seneca the philosopher. That was his son. But Seneca the Elder says, when I was younger, my memory was really good. Now I'm old, my memory's fading, so don't hold me to a very high standard. But when I was young, I could be introduced to 2,000 people in succession and repeat back their names in exactly the order in which I just met them. I could be given a poem of 200 verses and repeat it back in reverse order. But he says, now I'm old. And so all I can do now that I'm old, all those famous orators you've heard of? We all went to oratory school together, declamation school together. So I bet you'd be interested in what their practice speeches were in declamation school. And he proceeds to give back pieces of over 100 of those practice speeches. Now, I can barely remember what I spoke on in my homiletics classes, my speech classes. So that's an extreme example. But you've got other examples, like the person who goes into a poetry reading, and after somebody in front has read their poem, somebody in the back says, "Wait, that's my poem. I can prove it," and proceeds to repeat back the poem verbatim from memory. And while the person up front is befuddled, the person in the back says, I just wanted to show off how good my memory was. I just memorized your poem as you were reading it." And another person who goes into an auction and at the end of the day can repeat back every item that was sold, the price for which it was sold, and the person to whom it was sold with no notes. That was true of, that's an aspiration. Obviously, not everybody did that.
Sure.
And there were specific mnemotechnics, I guess is the mnemotechnics. I'm mixing up my languages. I think mnemotechnics was the German, but anyway, who would, special ways you would memorize things for professionals. But for other people, they just used, regular memory. So you had these uneducated bards who would travel from place to place and repeat the entirety of Homer's Iliad and Odyssey from memory. Intellectuals looked down on them because they weren't, doing anything really critical with the sources. They were just memorizing them.
They're
repeating them. So but even at the basic elementary level, you'd memorize sayings of famous teachers. And that was also used for moral instruction. So the more
Interesting.
moral the teacher, the better. Um, if you didn't have even elementary education, you still would learn proverbs and sayings that were in widespread circulation. I mean, in the Middle East today, many cultures, there's like thousands of proverbs in circulation.
What I've always wondered growing up in a Christian household is that, okay, you've got the disciples following around Jesus. And like I kept on thinking, well, did they just have like a notebook with them where they're constantly just like jotting things down? Or is it like after a day they're getting together and like, hey, how did he say that? Like, how are they recreating the story of Jesus in such a way that we can have confidence that the words that we're reading are actually what Jesus said, they are what Jesus did in a time when we didn't have video recorders and audio recorders and all the things that we would normally rely on for knowing the accuracy of something.
You just touched on a whole lot of points.
Okay,
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
I mean, worth consideration. No, the first one you mentioned was note taking, and in fact, that was customary in Greek and Roman education. So that um, to give an extraordinary example there, Quintilian in the mid first century, he was a professor of rhetoric, and he was teaching boys, elite boys, in Rome, and they took such careful notes on his lectures that they went then out and published a book in his name. And he responded by saying, I wish they would have consulted me. I could have corrected certain infelicities of grammar and so forth, but they got right my content.
Hmm.
But he says, now I'm going to give you my edited version. So and he's got his 5-volume book of oratory.
Wow.
You also have philosophic students, the other main Greek discipline, doing the same thing. So that's actually how we have sayings of some of the ancient philosophers, because they usually didn't write the things themselves. That job was left to their disciples.
And this is what time period, Quintilian and all this?
Quintilian is first century, so it's from the same period of the Gospels.
Okay.
But this period of taking notes and actually disciples publishing their teachers' teachings, this had been going on for like 5 centuries by the time we get to the Gospels. So that was the standard practice. You don't expect them to write it down themselves. You expect their students to write it down. Now, among Jewish disciples, there was such an emphasis on orality. And that's one reason why it's a red herring when people say, but the disciples may have been illiterate. Well, so what? I mean, usually people didn't write things down themselves. They dictated to scribes who wrote things down. If they were wealthy, they did it because they could afford the scribes. If they were poor, they did it because usually they weren't trained how to write much. And so either way, they would often depend on others to write the things down. But it's also a red herring because in a Jewish context, there was such an emphasis on orality that they were to just memorize it as they were hearing it, and they were allowed to take some notes. They did that sometimes, but and this continued actually the practice of the rabbis, and for those who say no, the rabbinic material is too late. Actually, you also have it. Josephus attests it in the first century for just Jewish boys growing up. They're taught to memorize the Torah. So emphasis on memory. And later, when you have Christian monks and so on, when they would say, okay, well, now that you're joining the monastery, memorize the book of Psalms, memorize this gospel or that gospel. And the people who were completely illiterate, they just have to do it orally. They just keep drilling them orally.
Yeah. So to that effect, like if they're illiterate and they're supposed to memorize this in an oral culture, so orality being spoken or being listened to, so then that must mean they are learning it from somebody else who is orally speaking it, or how would that transfer
Yes.
of information go?
Yeah, they could learn it from somebody who's reading it to them.
Okay.
But because this was the culture as a whole was a culture that included both literacy and orality,
Okay.
but they often would learn it just from hearing uh, oral presentation from somebody who may or may not have been able to read. Of course, there are Muslims in the world today who memorize the entire Quran
Hmm.
in Arabic without knowing Arabic even.
Yeah.
So without understanding the meaning, which is really important for memory, but
Yeah.
because it's in poetic form, that does help.
In the case of the disciples and Jesus, they've either taken notes or they've been like it's almost been their role as a disciple.
Right.
They
Exactly.
know I'm not just walking around kind of blindly following this guy. Like my role is to remember what he's saying and exactly what he's doing. So in my mind, I'm thinking, okay, I go through that a day. Like honestly, I can go through a week and forget what I did on Monday, and Tuesday, unless I've like written it down in a diary or something. So is there this process within that culture of at least documenting as you go, or I don't know what I'm, because I guess if they're illiterate, maybe that's not even possible. Like, how is it that we have the Gospels written, I don't know how many years later, but after Jesus's death, that the accuracy of that is still maintained?
Now, when I say illiterate, there are different levels of literacy.
Okay.
So people can often jot basic notes or write it on a pottery shirt or something without without being able to compose a gospel or something like that.
I see.
Um, but oh boy, again, you brought up so many points. But disciples were normally advanced students.
Okay.
Um, so in their teens, so beyond the elementary education. And like you said, the main responsibility of disciples was to be able to pass on the teachings of their teacher or their particular school. Now, that was often done the same way that we recommend, psychologists of memory recommend memory today: spaced practice
Hmm.
and repetition. That was characteristic of, I found Lucian talking about a certain philosophic school that way. The Pythagoreans were the extreme, and I mention them because they're memorable. The
Yeah.
extreme stuff is more memorable. That's why Jesus raising people from the dead. First few times that probably got the disciples' attention. That'd be memorable.
Yeah.
But the Pythagoreans, in principle, it says that they weren't allowed to get out of bed in the morning till they could repeat back everything their teacher taught them the day before. So that may be extreme.
Yeah.
Don't worry, those of you who are listening in. We're not going to test you tomorrow morning on this, but uh, they would repeat back things. And you mentioned earlier how disciples also probably got together and talked about it
Yeah.
with collective memory. So in memory studies, there's a distinction made between uh, net memory and chain memory. Chain memory is like when you pass it on to the next person, they pass it on to the next person one at a time.
Okay.
So, uh, like some people say, here's the telephone game. I
Yes.
say some things to one student, they say something to another. Get around 30 students, come back to the professor. Is it going to be the same thing that it went in as? Probably not, because there's going to be a weak link in the chain. But
Yeah.
that's 30 generations of memory. If I say it to the class and then I ask the class to respond, that's one generation of memory. That's net memory. So when Jesus teaches things to the disciples and then they give their collective memory, I mean, yeah, somebody there may be too sure of themselves and they have a bad memory. But chances are, with collective memory altogether, you're going to get, corrections. And I found with Philostratus in his biographies of the sophists, he talks about how when this one sophist died, his students got together and sewed together from their memory different pieces of his speeches. So it was customary for disciples to be able to do that with their teacher's teachings, and again to publish things in his name they could publish them orally and have somebody else write them down. Now, in terms of how long the memories would last, with verbatim memory, doesn't usually last very long.
Mm.
I I experience that myself when I'm taking notes on what somebody's writing and I'm trying to quote them exactly, and I have to keep looking back because my mind has already started paraphrasing what they're saying.
Yeah.
Gist memory, though, can last a long time, and verbatim memory only lasts a long time if you practice it. And that's most common with things like proverbs, aphorisms. Many of Jesus' sayings are kind of proverbial. They're crisp. They're like that. And so those sayings are probably remembered closer to verbatim. They also don't change as much from one gospel to another.
Mm.
But then you have things like parables, where if I tell a story to my kids, Jack and the Beanstalk, and I tell it differently the second time than I did the first time, my kid is not going to say, wait, or in my case, my grandkids are not going to say, wait, that's a different word than you used last time. If I change the story too much, they'll say that,
Yeah.
like, what, how come the giant landed on Jack when he cut down the beanstalk? But not because I changed a word here or there. Those aren't expected to be verbatim. So Jesus' parables are more like that, where there's
Mm.
more variation from one gospel to another.
Yeah.
And also the memory of events, kind of like the short stories we often have in the Gospels. Uh, Key events that are significant to us, things that we think are significant to us, about half of those we won't remember a year from now.
Yeah.
but the other half, um, things that go into our long-term memory and we still remember after 5 years, many of those we'll still remember after 50 years.
Mm.
About 50 years after the time that I was in third grade, my wife and I met one of my classmates from third grade, and she called her husband over. She said, "This is the guy I was telling you about." And she said, "Yeah, Craig Keener, in third grade, he was humming Gilligan's Island in class, and the teacher made him get up in front of the class and sing the whole song of Gilligan's Island. He didn't miss any of the words. He got the whole thing right, which I couldn't do now. But the point of it is, she remembered that event, and I remembered that event
Yeah.
independently for 50 years. She
Wow.
remembered it because she thought it was funny. I
Yeah.
remembered it because I was traumatized. But
Yeah.
events significant to us can
Yeah.
stick in our memories for a long time.
I can see that just from my own life and even seeing it in my boy's life. But I mean, Craig, you're a professor at a university and you've got students that are constantly listening to you and then going into a test less than a
Yep.
week later.
Yep.
And some of them are probably failing that test. Some of them are, hopefully most of them are doing well.
Yeah.
What,
Hopefully.
what has changed between then and now? Or it could just be my perception, but my perception is there was such a focus on memory back then that it was a skill that was developed, and it's
Yes.
not a focus now. So it doesn't seem like, is that the way that it is? That it's not that we have bad memories. It's just that we haven't been trained the same way that they used to in antiquity.
My friend from Lebanon who told me about that poem also told me that memory skills are declining now in the Middle East.
Mm.
People have iPhones, they have access to Google. And, my wife is from Congo in Central Africa. She's collected all this oral history. Her PhD's in history, but she also notes the younger generation isn't doing that anymore because we don't need to. Like in West Africa, there was something called the griot, who would be the repository of oral tradition for, the village. And now we don't need a griot. We have Google.
Yeah.
And I'm not at all saying that's bad.
Yeah.
I'm just saying our memories do what we need them to do, not what we don't need them to do. One of my neighbors, she passed away at the age of 96 a few years ago. But before she did that, I was like, oh, she's like my grandmother. So I would, I would talk with her, and she would tell me stories about what things were like. She was born in 1918. She told me about when she was growing up, well, they didn't have radio. where she was. They obviously they didn't have television or social media or things like that. They didn't have air conditioning, so everybody would sit on the front porch and they would tell stories. And they would often tell family stories that went back a few hundred years. And she told me family stories that went back to the 1700s, some of which I was able to confirm by checking Google.
Yeah.
She couldn't be doing it on Google. She was almost completely blind. And so when she was growing up also in school, there was such an emphasis on memory, memorizing long poems and so on. And that's not, that's not what education is centered on now, not what it needs to be centered on now. Although if the internet goes down, we will be very grateful for people who memorize their Bibles.
But I do think there is something to this idea that I'm training my brain. It's like that muscle that I'm saying, hey, this is important to me, and so I want to continually train my brain in memorization of this text in particular, and I found that to be of immense value in a lot of different areas of life. We have that culture of memory that we've been talking about. I assume there's also kind of this idea of collaboration that we were talking about. So, you've got a lot of the different authors who are all the disciples who are kind of getting together. I assume you also have eyewitnesses. Like, are there other pieces to this puzzle that I may be missing that help us with a confidence in the accuracy of the Bible, the Gospels in particular?
When you repeat something a lot of times, you're going to reinforce your memory. You'll reinforce it in the form in which you typically repeat it, in particular. But I mean, when I give my testimony of my conversion from atheism, I have a kind of a short version that I usually tell. I still remember the long version, though. I still remember all sorts of, the names of the people that I don't normally give because it's not relevant to anybody. To whom would people who joined the Jesus movement at the beginning, to whom would they look for information about Jesus? I mean, who's going to be telling the stories about Jesus? They're going to expect the disciples to do it, the eyewitnesses to do it. And in antiquity, obviously, historians, like historians today, when they want to do something, they consult especially the eyewitnesses or those who knew the eyewitnesses if the events are within living memory. Who were the best kind of witnesses? The best kind of witnesses would be disciples, especially if you want to know the person's teachings, because those were the people who were normally tasked with passing on the information. Almost all scholars agree that Jesus was a teacher. Now, if Jesus was a teacher, the implication of that in antiquity, he had disciples. So he would have people who would carry on the message. And when scholars are skeptical, one thing they barely ever are skeptical about is that Paul wrote 1 Corinthians, Paul wrote Galatians, and some other letters. Well, it's clear in 1 Corinthians and Galatians that the people leading the Jerusalem church, the disciples, you had especially Peter and John, you had James, the brother of Jesus, who give some different kind of background. Those are the people in leadership. So there's no question where you go to get things out of the horse's mouth, so to speak. In terms of people being able to write the things down, obviously Paul is able to write things down.
Yeah.
But he doesn't write Gospels because he wasn't there for those events. But he sometimes recounts things that we have in the Gospels. He recounts sayings of Jesus that we have. I believe when he talks about this, we said to you by the word of the Lord, 1 Thessalonians 4:15 or so, and then he gives sayings about what's going to happen at the end. There and in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, you can compare them with a lot of ancient scenarios about the end, ancient Jewish scenarios of the end. It's so close instead, just in a summary of a couple paragraphs to what we have in Matthew 24 and other sayings of Jesus. Romans 12 through 14, we have sayings of Jesus popping up there. about ethics, some of them from the Sermon on the Mount or Sermon on the Plain. We also have, in First Corinthians, we have a number of sayings where Paul actually says this is a saying of Jesus.
Yeah.
The one about divorce, the one about taking care of the worker, and so forth. In the Lord's Supper, and then what he says about the what was handed on to him about the resurrection and the witnesses of the resurrection.
Yeah.
So all that stuff was handed on carefully, and then we have Paul alluding to some of Jesus' deeds, and with the different gospels, the usual critical dating of Mark. So I mean, there are different views. Some central date that people usually give for the Gospel of Mark is around 40 years after the resurrection. 40 years before us is not shrouded in amnesia. You know, I ask my students, how many of you were around 40 years ago? Well, a lot of them weren't. See, how many of you know somebody who was around 40 years ago? If somebody completely fabricates the history of 40 years ago, is that going to convince you? You know, your parents were around 40 years ago. And, you know, if your parents talk about their wedding and you know, do you go to them and say, I need to see your marriage certificate because I don't believe you could remember something 40 years ago that you actually got married 40 years ago. There would still be eyewitnesses around at the time that Mark is writing these things down. And actually within living memory of when Mark is written, whenever people date Mark, somebody says that he got this from an eyewitness, that Mark was writing down what he got from Peter. And I think that's very likely true.
Okay.
But when I keep using the phrase living memory, in oral historiography, living memory is the period when the eyewitnesses are alive or those who knew the eyewitnesses are alive. Oral historians usually distinguish that as the period of oral history before the period of oral tradition kicks in. I mean, I still use the language of tradition, but technically in oral historiography, anything written within the first century is within living memory of the ministry of Jesus.
Interesting.
So all four gospels are within the period of living memory.
Okay.
And that's the period when we would expect ordinarily things to be remembered accurately. I mean, that's not to say nobody ever gets things wrong, but ordinarily, more likely than not, people are getting things right in that period.
So that brings up a question that I had, because I don't know if it's maybe our definition of accuracy maybe is a little bit different, but even when you think about like in the New Testament, I believe there's something like 300 times when the authors reference, 300 or more times when the authors reference something from the Old Testament. By no means any scholar, but my understanding is even those references are not, like in most cases, are not word for word references.
True. That's true.
And yet we don't look at that, and nobody that was in that time necessarily looked at that and said, oh my goodness, they're wrong, that's inaccurate.
Yeah.
So why is that? Why is that considered like it was almost like a paraphrase, even some of the times that Jesus did it, and that is okay. Is that my understanding?
Yep, exactly.
Okay.
And it has to be that way. I mean, the New Testament is written mostly in Greek.
Yeah.
And, you know, the Old Testament's written in Hebrew. You can quote the Greek version of it, the standard Greek version of it, and the New Testament often does, but it also has variation, sometimes because of the Hebrew, sometimes just because, you know, sometimes they're combining allusions to other texts, and,
Yeah.
you know, sometimes they're already starting to preach when they're quoting the text by adapting it to meet the current situation.
Yeah.
There's no reason to expect that when New Testament writers quote Jesus, it has to be verbatim, word for word, especially when we're getting it in Greek, and Jesus was often speaking it in Aramaic. And just nobody had that standard at that point. So you have people who recite ballads hours and hours in length in different parts of the world today. You ask them, is this going to be verbatim next time you do it? And they'll say yes, but it's not verbatim by tape recorder standards, because these are places where they don't have tape recorders.
Yeah.
But it's pretty impressive. I mean, I'm pretty impressed.
I almost wonder then if that represents a better memory? Because if you're able to recall it in almost a different form while maintaining content accuracy, I think that represents a better memory because you understand it, versus there are times when if I like run up against a word that I forgot word for word in a verse, oftentimes that represents more the fact that I didn't understand the verse because I can't recall, I can't even like summarize the rest of it because I've just forgotten a word. So that makes a lot of sense to me. That's very interesting. It's like it's a different standard, but at the same time, we have a different view of what memory looks like, I think, nowadays than they did in antiquity.
Just memory presupposes a level of understanding, and that was the expectation in the ancient world.
Yeah.
When I originally started memorizing verses shortly after my conversion, a verse here and a verse there, and sometimes I was treating like all the verses in between as blank space. But when I got provoked by somebody who was reading through the New Testament every week, so I started doing that myself. And reading through the New Testament once a week or through the Bible once a month, well, then it starts coming together because now these memory verses, I see the context, I see how it fits together. And so when I remember something is in like 1 Peter chapter 3, it's not because I memorized that it was in 1 Peter chapter 3. It's because I learned where it was in the flow of the argument of 1 Peter about what it says here. So I know, okay, here's the paragraph before it, here's the paragraph after it. Different kind of appropriation by memory.
Last thing I want to ask, because I want to respect your time here, but one of the things I remember, I can't remember if it was Socrates or Aristotle, one of the ancient philosophers was known for using the method of loci, or the kind of what we call now the mind palace method for memorizing some of his orations. And were there certain types of techniques that were used in antiquity, or was it really just repetition? Just repeating it over and over again.
Just ordinary, everyday people, it would be especially repetition and in spaced practice. Distinguishing between psychological memory and social memory. So the psychological memory of the disciples is important. Well, the social memory is what the community as a whole, they would learn the stories. So when Luke says in Luke chapter 1, verses 3 and 4, I'm doing this, Theophilus, to confirm what you already know, that tells us something too, because it means that when Luke is writing, what he's writing, he can't be making up. He's confirming what Theophilus has already heard. And I did this goes beyond memory specifically, but in the nature of the Gospels, when you have ancient biographies of the kind where the sources overlap, where we can test them and see the sources overlap. So the kind of biographies written in the early empire, same period as the Gospels, Suetonius and Plutarch and others, we can test them. They stick so closely to their sources. That seems to be the expectation for biography in the period of the early empire. So the Gospel writers are writing in a period where the expectation for writing about a recent historical figure works. The expectations were this is supposed to be based on information. It's not supposed to be based on your imagination. Not that, imagination obviously enters into how you frame it and so on, but it's supposed to be information based. And based on that, based on the fact that the information would go back ultimately to disciples, and based on the nature of memory in antiquity, by the time this stuff gets written down, we have, I think, really good reason to believe what we got in the Gospels brings us face to face with Jesus.
A special thank you to Dr. Craig Keener for his time. He's written, again, numerous books and commentaries that are available on Amazon, and I recommend you check those out, especially if you're interested in history and New Testament background. And if you enjoyed this conversation, you'll really like the one I did with Professor Brad East, who talked about the impact of biblical illiteracy on the next generation of Christians. I'll link to that in the show notes. God bless.